The desert sun beat down on North Africa like the fist of God, turning the sand into a shimmering mirror of heat that bent light itself into cruel illusions. Lieutenant Klaus Becker lay face down in that sand, his uniform torn and dust-caked, his throat raw from shouting orders that no longer mattered because the battle was over and they had lost. Around him, what remained of his unit, boys mostly, teenagers with smooth faces now streaked with dirt and tears, sat with their hands clasped behind their heads, watching American soldiers move through the wreckage of their position with weapons raised and eyes alert. Klaus had been taught since before the war, since the rallies and the radio broadcasts and the endless repetition of doctrine, that Americans were weak, decadent, corrupted by jazz music and Jewish influence and democratic softness. He had been told they would fight without honor, that they were mongrels without culture, that capture by them meant torture and humiliation and death. Now, lying in the Tunisian sand with his face pressed against earth that smelled of cordite and blood, he waited for that torture to begin. It didn't come. Instead, a shadow fell across him and a voice speaking accented but clear German said, "On your feet, soldier." Slowly. Klaus rose, expecting a rifle but to his spine or a kick to his ribs. But the American sergeant who stood before him simply gestured with his Thompson submachine gun toward a cluster of other prisoners being assembled near a burned-out half-track. The sergeant's face showed no particular malice, no sadistic pleasure, just the weary professionalism of a man doing his job at the end of a long day. Klaus stumbled toward the group, his mind racing to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been promised. Where was the savage vengeance? Where were the barbaric Americans he had been warned about? Around him, his men murmured similar confusion in low voices, their eyes darting between their captors and each other, searching for answers that wouldn't come. They were marched to a temporary holding area as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and copper and dried blood. British and American troops moved efficiently around them, setting up perimeters, treating wounded, cataloging prisoners. Klaus noticed that their own wounded were being carried on the same stretchers as Allied wounded, tended by the same medics, given the same morphine. This made no sense. In his training, in the countless briefings and propaganda films, the Americans had been portrayed as devils who would revel in German suffering, who would exact revenge for every Allied casualty with compound interest. Yet here they were, being treated according to some code that seemed to transcend national hatred. An American soldier, young enough to be in university under different circumstances, handed Klaus a canteen. The water was warm but clean, and Klaus drank greedily, shamefully, unable to stop himself despite the voice in his head that screamed about accepting charity from the enemy. When he finished, the American nodded and moved on to the next prisoner, and Klaus stood there holding the empty canteen like a sacred object, trying to understand what it meant. Night fell over the desert with the sudden finality that only deserts know, and Klaus sat among his captured comrades wrapped in a blanket that the Americans had distributed, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the closer sounds of the camp settling into darkness. Corporal Werner Richter, who had served with Klaus since the beginning, sat beside him picking at the remains of a ration pack, American rations, dense and sweet and strange, but undeniably food. "They're softening us up," Werner whispered, his voice carrying the certainty of someone clinging to familiar explanations. "Making us comfortable before the interrogations begin. The real Americans will come later, the ones we've heard about." Klaus wanted to believe this because it would make the world make sense again, would restore the clear lines between us and them, between civilization and barbarism. But something in him, some small voice that had begun speaking the moment that first canteen was offered, suggested a different truth, one far more complicated and dangerous to consider. The days that followed collapsed into a rhythm of movement and waiting, of being loaded onto trucks and driven to ports, of standing in lines while American officers with clipboards checked names and numbers against incomprehensible lists. At every stage, Klaus expected the mask to drop, expected the promised cruelty to finally manifest, but it never did. The guards were firm but not brutal. The food, while simple, was regular and sufficient. When one of the prisoners, a boy named Hans who couldn't have been more than 17, fell ill with dysentery, He was taken to a medical tent and treated with the same antibiotics the Americans gave their own soldiers. Klaus watched this happen with a growing sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath his understanding of the world was shifting, revealing depths he hadn't known existed. At night, lying on his cot in the holding facility near Oran, he stared at the canvas ceiling and wondered what was real, the propaganda that had shaped his entire adult life, or the evidence of his own eyes. Then came the ships. Great gray vessels that sat low in the water, Liberty ships and troop transports, their hulls painted in dull maritime camouflage, their decks swarming with activity as supplies and soldiers and prisoners moved in carefully orchestrated patterns. Klaus and several hundred other German POWs were marched up a gangplank onto one of these ships, down into a hold that had been converted into temporary prisoner quarters, and the journey that would change everything began. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks existed in a strange liminal space where normal rules seemed suspended. The prisoners were kept below deck for most of the journey, but they weren't chained or beaten. They were fed twice a day, not well, but adequately, which was more than the U-boats had managed to do to Allied convoys. American guards rotated in shifts, watching the prisoners with what Klaus gradually recognized as boredom rather than hatred. One guard, a heavy-set man from somewhere called Iowa who couldn't pronounce German names and so called everyone Fritz, spent his shifts reading paperback novels and occasionally sharing cigarettes through the bars of the holding area. "Nothing personal," he said once, in English that Klaus barely understood but whose tone was unmistakable. "Just a job, you know. War's war, but it ain't gonna last forever." The propaganda had said nothing about this. The propaganda had painted a picture of Americans as subhuman, as lacking culture or honor or humanity, as being worthy only of contempt and righteous destruction. But here was this guard from Iowa, this ordinary man with a ring on his finger that suggested a wife somewhere and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, treating Klaus and the others with either cruelty nor particular kindness, just the distant professionalism of someone doing necessary work. It was destabilizing in a way that Klaus struggled to articulate even in his own thoughts. If the Americans weren't monsters, then what did that make the war? What did that make the cause they had fought for? These were dangerous questions, the kind that could unravel a man's entire understanding of himself, and so Klaus pushed them down and focused on survival, on getting through each day without having to examine the implications of what he was experiencing. The ship rolled through heavy seas somewhere mid-Atlantic, and Klaus found himself violently seasick, heaving into a bucket while the hold pitched and yawed around him. An American medic came through, distributing pills for motion sickness, and when Klaus refused out of some stubborn remnant of pride, the medic simply shrugged and left the pills on the deck beside him. "Your call, Fritz," the medic said, not unkindly. "But we got a week left on this tub and you're gonna feel every mile of it without help." Klaus waited until the medic was gone, then took the pills, and within an hour the worst of the nausea had subsided to something manageable. This small mercy, this casual act of compassion extended without expectation or fanfare, lingered in Klaus's mind long after his stomach had settled. It suggested a worldview in which the suffering of enemies was not a goal unto itself, in which the basic dignity of captured soldiers was something worth preserving even when it served no strategic purpose. This was not weakness, Klaus realized with growing unease. This was something else entirely, something the propaganda had no words for. America announced itself first as a smell, the distinct scent of a continent, different from Europe or Africa, something green and industrial and vast drifting across the water as they approached port. Then came the skyline, first as a smudge on the horizon and then as a rising wall of buildings taller than anything Klaus had seen outside of Berlin, their windows catching the morning sun in a million fragments of reflected light. The ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia, and Klaus got his first look at America through a porthole, a glimpse of a country that seemed impossibly prosperous, impossibly untouched by the war that had reduced so much of Europe to rubble. Cars moved along distant streets. Civilians walked freely. Somewhere, a radio played music that drifted across the water, big band jazz with a swinging rhythm that seemed to mock the very concept of wartime austerity. This was the enemy homeland. This was the country they had sought to help defeat. Looking at it, Klaus felt something crack inside his certainty, a hairline fracture in the edifice of belief that had sustained him through years of combat. They were processed through the port facility with bureaucratic efficiency, photographed and fingerprinted and assigned numbers that would follow them through their captivity. American officers explained in German, through interpreters, the rules that would govern their internment, the Geneva Convention standards they would be held to, the work details they might be assigned to, the male privileges they would have, the expected behaviors and prohibited activities. It was all very official, very organized, very American in its combination of formality and practicality. Klaus signed forms he didn't fully understand and answered questions about his service record and listened to lectures about camp discipline and tried to process the fundamental strangeness of being an enemy prisoner in a country that seemed to be operating according to some elaborate script that no one had bothered to explain to him. Around him, his fellow prisoners reacted with similar confusion, their faces showing the strain of trying to reconcile expectation with reality, propaganda with lived experience. The train journey inland was Klaus's introduction to the sheer scale of America, to distances that dwarfed anything in Europe, to landscapes that seemed to roll on forever in variations of farmland and forest, and small towns that looked like they had been copied from the same template and scattered across the countryside at regular intervals. They traveled for 2 days in converted freight cars, the doors left partially open so they could see the country they had become prisoners in. Kansas, someone said. Oklahoma. Texas. The names meant nothing to Klaus except as points on a map he had studied before the war, when the world had still made sense and his role in it had been clear. Now, watching America slide past through the open door, he felt increasingly unmoored from the certainties that had defined his life. This country was huge, unbelievably huge, with resources and space that made the cramped battlefields of Europe seem like backyard squabbles. How had they ever thought they could win against this? How had the propaganda convinced them that America was weak when every mile of track they traveled revealed more evidence of a nation operating at a scale Germany could never match? Camp Hearne in Texas was one of 700 such facilities scattered across the American landscape, housing over 425,000 German POWs between 1942 and 1946. Klaus didn't know these numbers then, had no sense of being part of something so massive and systematic. But he would learn them later, after the war, when historians and journalists would piece together the story of the largest prisoner of war program in American history. What Klaus knew in that moment, stepping off the train into the brutal humidity of a Texas summer, was that the camp looked nothing like he had expected. There were guard towers, yes, and barbed wire fences, and armed soldiers watching from elevated positions. But there were also neat rows of barracks painted white, and paved walkways between buildings, and what appeared to be a baseball diamond on the far side of the compound. It looked, Klaus thought with a strange sense of dislocation, like a military base rather than a prison, like somewhere soldiers might be stationed rather than held captive. The camp commandant, a colonel with gray hair and a West Point ring, addressed them through an interpreter that first evening, explaining the rules and expectations and daily routine that would govern their lives for the duration of their captivity. They would be assigned to barracks organized by rank, would receive 3 meals a day according to Geneva Convention standards, would be expected to participate in work details for which they would be paid script that could be used in the camp canteen. They would be allowed to write letters home, receive packages, participate in recreational activities. Any attempt to escape would be met with punishment, but there would be no torture, no starvation, no summary executions. The colonel spoke in the measured tones of someone conveying information rather than making threats, and Klaus found himself believing him, found himself accepting that this bizarre alternate reality in which captured enemy soldiers were treated like human beings was somehow the actual plan rather than an elaborate deception. It was disorienting in the extreme, like discovering that up was down and down was up, that all the fundamental rules you had operated under were simply wrong. The barracks were simple but adequate. Wooden structures with bunks and footlockers and windows that actually opened to let in whatever breeze the Texas summer might offer. Klaus claimed a lower bunk near the door and set about organizing his few possessions, the ritual of creating personal space providing a small measure of control in a situation defined by its lack of autonomy. Around him, other prisoners did the same, unpacking meager belongings, staking claims to territory, beginning the process of adaptation that all prisoners must undergo. Werner Richter took the bunk above Klaus, and they lay there that first night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the camp settling into darkness, crickets and distant voices and the regular footsteps of guards making their rounds. "This won't last," Werner said quietly, repeating his mantra from North Africa. "They're building trust so the interrogations will be more effective. You'll see." But Klaus, staring at the wooden ceiling 6 inches from his face, wasn't so sure anymore. The days developed their own rhythm, a structure imposed by the camp authorities, but surprisingly humane in its implementation. Morning roll call at 6, breakfast at 7, work details assigned by 8. Klaus found himself part of a crew sent to a nearby farm to help with the cotton harvest, work that was hard and hot but no different than the agricultural labor he had done as a boy in Bavaria. The American farmer who supervised them was a taciturn man in his 60s, weathered by decades of Texas sun, who communicated primarily through gestures and seemed to regard the whole situation as a minor inconvenience rather than a moral crisis. At midday, he would have his wife bring out lunch for the workers, sandwiches and lemonade and sometimes cookies, and the German prisoners would sit in the shade of an old oak tree eating American food and trying to make sense of being fed by the enemy in the middle of a war. The farmer's grandson, a boy of about 10, would sometimes come out to watch them work, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, and Klaus would wonder what stories the boy had been told about Germans, what nightmares lurked in his child's imagination when he thought about the men his country was fighting. Evening brought different routines. After dinner in the mess hall, solid, unimaginative food but plenty of it, more reliable than anything Klaus had eaten during the last year of the war, there were organized activities. Sports leagues had formed, soccer mostly but also volleyball and the mysterious American game of baseball which some of the prisoners tried to learn with varying degrees of success. There were classes, prisoners teaching each other English or mathematics or engineering, maintaining skills and sanity through education. There was a small library with books in German, some sent by the Red Cross, others donated by German-American communities who seemed to exist in complicated spaces of dual loyalty. Klaus read Goethe and Schiller and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in the Kultur that was supposed to separate Germans from lesser peoples, but the words seemed hollow now, drained of meaning by the reality of his situation. It was in the 3rd week of captivity that the announcement came: movie night. Klaus heard the news with incomprehension, certain he had misunderstood the interpreter's German. Movies? They were going to show movies to prisoners of war? It seemed absurd, impossible. Yet another piece of evidence that reality had somehow jumped tracks and was now running on rails that logic couldn't follow. But the preparations were real enough. Prisoners setting up folding chairs in one of the larger recreation halls, American soldiers wheeling in a projector and screen, the camp's Protestant chaplain working with the equipment with the air of someone who had done this many times before. "Every 2 weeks," someone explained to Klaus. "They show films every 2 weeks. Hollywood pictures, mostly. Sometimes newsreels." Klaus stood in the doorway watching these preparations with a feeling he couldn't name, something suspended between disbelief and a strange anticipatory curiosity. That evening, as the sun set over the Texas prairie and the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive, Klaus found himself sitting in a folding chair surrounded by German prisoners of war, watching an American soldier thread celluloid through a projector while a second soldier adjusted the screen. The hall filled with the murmur of conversation, hundreds of men wondering what they were about to see, what this strange ritual meant, whether it was some kind of test or trick or inexplicable kindness. Werner sat beside Klaus, his arms crossed, his face set in lines of suspicion. "Propaganda," he muttered. "Has to be. They'll show us films about why we should betray the fatherland, why we should give up information, why we should become traitors." Others echoed this theory, nodding agreement, clinging to explanations that fit their understanding of how enemies should behave. The lights went down. The projector whirred to life. A beam of light cut through the darkness and splashed across the white screen, and suddenly they were somewhere else entirely. The film was a Western, one of those mythic tales of the American frontier that Hollywood churned out by the dozen, starring someone named John Wayne whose square jaw and easy confidence filled the screen. Cowboys and Indians, dusty towns and shootouts, horses thundering across impossible landscapes under skies so big they seemed to dwarf human concerns entirely. It was nothing like what Werner had predicted, no propaganda about the war or appeals to betrayal or sophisticated psychological operations. It was just a movie, just entertainment, just 2 hours of escape into a fictional world that had nothing to do with the real one outside. Klaus sat in the darkness watching this film with a growing sense of vertigo, trying to understand what was happening to him. Around him, prisoners began to relax, drawn into the story despite themselves, laughing at the comic relief sidekick, gasping at the action sequences, booing the villain with the black hat. They were responding to the film like an audience anywhere might respond, like human beings capable of being entertained and moved by stories, and in doing so they were implicitly acknowledging their own humanity, and the humanity of the people who had made this film, and the humanity of the captors who had chosen to show it to them. This was dangerous. This threatened everything. Klaus felt his carefully maintained defenses beginning to crumble, felt the propaganda losing its grip on his mind, felt something new and terrifying beginning to take its place. The film ended to scattered applause, and the lights came up to reveal hundreds of German prisoners blinking in the sudden brightness, their faces showing a complex mixture of emotions that Klaus suspected mirrored his own. Confusion. Pleasure. Guilt. The strange cognitive dissonance of having enjoyed something provided by the enemy, of having been treated like a human being rather than an animal to be punished or a resource to be exploited. Around him, prisoners filed out in small groups, talking in low voices about what they had seen, debating the film's merits with the seriousness of people desperate for distraction from their circumstances. Klaus walked out into the cooling Texas night, and stood for a long moment staring up at stars that looked the same as they did over Germany, wondering what he was becoming, wondering if he even wanted to hold on to what he had been. "It doesn't mean anything," Werner said, appearing beside him. "It's just a movie. Entertainment. A way to keep us docile." But there was uncertainty in his voice now, a wavering in the absolute certainty that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. Klaus didn't reply. He stood there under the foreign stars thinking about propaganda and truth, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of incomprehensible situations, about the ways that small acts of unexpected kindness can undermine entire ideologies. The Americans had shown them a movie. Not a propaganda film, not a re-education tool, just a movie, entertainment, a gesture that implied they were men capable of appreciating stories rather than beasts to be caged and forgotten. Klaus couldn't quite articulate why this mattered so much, but he felt it in his bones, felt some fundamental shift occurring in how he understood himself and his situation and the world. The work continued, day after day under the punishing Texas sun. Klaus and his crew picked cotton until their hands were raw and their backs ached, returned to camp for evening meals and showers and the routines that structured captive life. But something had changed after that first movie night. Some invisible line had been crossed. Conversations began to shift, carefully at first and then with increasing openness. Prisoners began to question things they had accepted without examination, to compare propaganda with lived experience, to wonder aloud about truths they had been taught versus realities they were observing. It started with small things. Comments about the food being better than expected, observations about the relative humanity of the guards, questions about why a nation of supposed degenerates seemed so organized and prosperous. But these small questions had a way of leading to larger ones, of pulling at threads that, once tugged, threatened to unravel entire tapestries of belief. Klaus found himself in increasingly frequent conversations with an older prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, who had fought in the First War and been recalled to duty for this one. Vogel had a way of asking questions that seemed innocent but carried implications that reached far beyond their immediate content. "If the Americans are as weak and degenerate as we were told," he would say, "then how did they build all this?" Gesturing at the camp, at the abundance they saw daily, at the massive industrial machine that had captured them and transported them, and now held them in conditions that exceeded what many of them had experienced in their own army. "If they're subhuman, If they lack culture and honor, then why do they treat us according to the Geneva Convention when they could simply shoot us and save the trouble? These questions hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to answer without confronting uncomfortable truths. The second movie night came 2 weeks after the first, and this time Klaus noticed that the skepticism had diminished, that prisoners were filing into the hall with something approaching anticipation rather than suspicion. The film this time was a musical, all song and dance and technicolor brightness, so far removed from the realities of war that it seemed to come from another universe entirely. Klaus watched characters tap dance across elaborate sets and sing about love and hope and the future, and felt something inside him that he had thought was dead begin to stir. It was joy, he realized with shock. Simple, uncomplicated joy at something beautiful and well-made, at the sheer exuberant life of the thing. When had he last felt joy? When had he last allowed himself to simply enjoy something without calculating its utility, or measuring it against ideological purity? Years, probably. Maybe since before the war, before the constant pressure to conform, to believe, to subordinate personal feeling to collective purpose. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Young men who had forgotten how to smile found themselves grinning at the on-screen antics. Hardened soldiers who had seen friends die in North Africa or Italy found themselves humming the musical numbers on the walk back to their barracks. It was as though the films were performing some kind of alchemy, transmuting the base metal of their cynicism and despair into something lighter and more hopeful, if only for a few hours. Klaus noticed that even Werner, stubborn Werner who clung to his suspicions like a drowning man to driftwood, had laughed during the film, had forgotten himself enough to be moved by what he was seeing. In the morning, Werner would probably deny this, would reconstruct his walls and reassert that none of it meant anything. But Klaus had seen the laughter, had witnessed the momentary surrender, and he knew that the walls were cracking, that truth was seeping through. Letters began arriving from Germany, passed through military censors who blacked out anything that might reveal strategic information but left enough to convey the essential facts. Klaus received one from his sister, written in her careful script, telling him that their hometown had been bombed, that their mother was living with relatives in the countryside, that food was scarce and hope scarcer. She didn't say that Germany was losing the war, couldn't say that without running afoul of censors on both sides, but the implications were clear enough between the lines. Klaus read the letter sitting on his bunk while late afternoon light slanted through the barack windows, and felt the last remnants of his faith in ultimate German victory crumble. They were losing. Had perhaps already lost, were just playing out the endgame, while the propaganda insisted on inevitable triumph. And here he sat in Texas, a prisoner who ate 3 meals a day and watched Hollywood movies and worked on farms that produced more food than he had seen in years in Germany. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. He showed the letter to Vogel that evening, needing to share the weight of it with someone who might understand. The older man read it carefully, then handed it back with a sad smile. "My daughter writes similar things," Vogel said. "Half the city gone. People living in basements. Children going hungry while we are fed by our captors. It's obscene, isn't it? We're the lucky ones. We lost and got captured and now we're safe and fed while our families suffer. While our cities burn. While everything we fought for turns to ash." His voice carried no bitterness, just a terrible weariness, the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and understood too clearly. "The question," Vogel continued, "is what we do with this knowledge. What we become after. Because we will go home eventually, those of us who survive. And we will carry these experiences with us. These truths that contradict everything we were taught to believe." The camp's Protestant chaplain, an American minister named Reverend Morrison, began holding regular discussion groups in addition to his religious services. Klaus attended more out of boredom than piety, expecting sermons and conversion attempts, but found instead something more subtle and more dangerous: conversations about morality and duty and the nature of just war, about following orders versus following conscience, about the difference between loyalty to a country and loyalty to its current government. Reverend Morrison never pushed, never preached directly about the evils of Nazism or tried to force political conversion. He just asked questions, the same kinds of questions that Vogel asked, questions that required prisoners to think rather than recite, to examine rather than accept. "What does it mean to be a good man?" Morrison would ask. "What does it mean to serve something larger than yourself? How do we know when we're serving good versus serving evil?" These were not theoretical questions anymore, not abstract philosophy. They were urgent, personal, terrifying in their implications. Klaus found himself attending these discussions regularly, found himself engaging with ideas he had been taught were dangerous, decadent, corrupted by Jewish Bolshevik influence. Democracy. Individual conscience. The notion that governments could be wrong, that leaders could be evil, that following orders was not always the highest moral good. These concepts were revolutionary in their way, threatened to overturn everything Klaus had built his identity upon. If Hitler had been wrong, if the cause had been unjust, if they had fought and killed and nearly died for something evil, then what did that make him? What did that make all of them? These were questions that had no comfortable answers, that threatened to leave him adrift without purpose or identity, or meaning. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't push them away. The evidence was all around him, in the kindness of guards who should have been monsters, in the prosperity of a nation he had been told was weak, in his own growing realization that everything he had believed might have been a lie. Another movie night. This time a comedy, something light and silly and American, full of slapstick and misunderstanding and happy endings. Klaus watched it and laughed and felt guilty for laughing and wondered when that guilt would fade, when he would accept that feeling joy didn't make him a traitor to the men who hadn't made it, to the cause they had ostensibly served. Around him, the hall was full of laughter, German prisoners delighting in American humor, sharing a moment of common humanity across the gulf of war and ideology. This was the real propaganda, Klaus realized. Not crude posters or heavy-handed lectures about democracy, but this, showing them that the enemy was human, was capable of creating beauty and humor and art, was worthy of something other than the dehumanizing hatred they had been fed for years. It was more effective than any torture could have been, more devastating to their worldview than any interrogation. The Americans, whether they knew it or not, were winning a different war, were changing minds and hearts through the simple revolutionary act of treating prisoners like human beings. The seasons changed, summer heat giving way to autumn coolness, and then to the mild Texas winter that seemed barely worthy of the name to men who had experienced European cold. Christmas came, and the camp authorities arranged for packages from the Red Cross, for special meals, for a decorated tree in the mess hall. It was surreal, celebrating the birth of Christ with their captors, singing carols in German while American guards stood watch nearby. Klaus thought about Christmases before the war, about family gatherings and midnight mass and his father reading from the Bible in their warm living room. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated not just by miles and years but by the unbridgeable gulf of experience, by everything he had seen and done and become. He couldn't go back to who he had been. Couldn't unknow what he now knew. Couldn't restore the simple certainties that had once guided his life. New Year's Eve, 1944. The war was entering its final phase, though no one in the camp knew exactly how close to the end they were. Klaus stood outside the barracks in the cool night air, watching his breath mist in the darkness, thinking about the year that had passed and the year to come. A year ago, he had been a soldier in the Wehrmacht, had believed in ultimate victory, had accepted without question that his cause was just and his enemies were evil. Now he was a prisoner in Texas who spent his days picking cotton and his evenings watching Hollywood movies and his nights lying awake wondering who he was and what he believed and what awaited him when the war finally ended. The transformation was so complete, so total, that sometimes he felt like two different people occupying the same body, the old Klaus and the new Klaus existing in an uneasy partnership that couldn't last forever. In February of 1945, newsreels began appearing before the feature films, American propaganda showing the war's progress, the advances in Europe and the Pacific, the slow inexorable closing of the vice around Germany. The camp authorities didn't hide these newsreels, didn't pretend the war wasn't happening or that Germany was winning. They showed them matter-of-factly, and Klaus and his fellow prisoners watched in silence as their country was systematically dismantled, as cities they had known were reduced to rubble, as the grand ambitions that had launched the war dissolved into ignominious defeat. Some prisoners turned away, unable to watch. Others stared at the screen with expressions of shock or grief or relief. Werner, sitting beside Klaus, wept quietly, tears running down his face as he watched Dresden burn on the flickering screen. "All for nothing," he whispered. "All of it for nothing." Spring brought news of Hitler's death, of the fall of Berlin, of Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. In the camp, reactions were mixed. Some prisoners celebrated the end of the killing, others mourned what they saw as a betrayal, still others simply felt numb, hollowed out by years of conflict and the sudden absence of purpose that peace implied. Klaus felt mainly tired, bone-deep exhausted by everything that had led to this moment, by the weight of knowledge he now carried. Germany had lost. The cause had been defeated. And he was alive and safe and well-fed on the other side of the world, had survived because of a strange twist of fate that had turned capture into salvation rather than the doom the propaganda had promised. It was almost impossible to process, the sheer scale of what had happened, the way the world had been turned inside out, and would have to be rebuilt from scratch. The movie nights continued, became if anything more frequent as the camp authorities seemed to recognize that their prisoners needed distraction from the psychological weight of defeat and uncertainty about the future. Klaus watched more films in those months after Germany's surrender than he had seen in his entire life before. Westerns and comedies and dramas and musicals, a crash course in American cinema that was simultaneously an education in American values and American dreams. He noticed themes that recurred across films, ideas about individual worth and second chances and the possibility of redemption, about community and cooperation and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. These weren't the martial values he had been raised with, weren't about strength through struggle or triumph of will or subordination of self to state. They were softer, more humanistic, built on assumptions about human nature and human potential that contradicted everything he had learned in the Hitler Youth. One film in particular stuck with him, a Frank Capra picture about a man contemplating suicide who is shown by an angel how many lives he has touched, how much good he has done without recognizing it, how the world would be darker without his presence in it. Klaus watched this film and felt something break open inside him, felt himself crying in the darkness of the recreation hall, surrounded by other men who were also crying because they too were recognizing something in this story that spoke to their condition. They had been taught that their worth came from service to the state, from conformity to ideology, from participation in a grand historical struggle. This film suggested something different, that individual lives mattered, that small kindnesses accumulated into something meaningful, that one person's decency could ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. It was revolutionary in the truest sense, overthrew the foundations of everything Klaus had built his identity upon. After the film, walking back to the barracks with Vogel and a few others, Klaus tried to articulate what he was feeling. "It's like they're showing us what we could have been," he said haltingly. "What we might still become. Not through force or struggle or sacrifice for some abstract greater good, but just through being decent. Through treating each other with kindness. Through recognizing that every person matters." Vogel nodded slowly. "It's the opposite of everything we were taught," he agreed. "And that's the point, I think. They're not just holding us prisoner. They're trying to show us a different way of being human, one that doesn't require enemies or struggle or constant conflict. Whether it will work, whether we can carry this back to Germany and build something new from the ruins, that remains to be seen." The question of return loomed larger as spring turned to summer in 1945. Germany was occupied, divided between the Allied powers, its cities devastated and its people scattered or dead or struggling to survive in conditions that made the prisoner of war camps in America seem like luxury resorts by comparison. Klaus received letters describing rubble and hunger and chaos, describing a country that no longer resembled the place he had left. His sister wrote that she was scavenging in ruins for anything burnable to heat water for washing, that children were dying of malnutrition, that women were trading whatever they had left for scraps of food. Reading these letters in his clean barack with dinner waiting in the mess hall and another movie scheduled for that evening, Klaus felt a survivor's guilt so profound it was almost physical, a nausea that no medicine could touch. He was safe while his family suffered. He was being educated in American values while his country starved. The irony was unbearable. Repatriation began slowly in late 1945 and accelerated through 1946, prisoners being processed and shipped back to Europe in reverse of the journey that had brought them to America. Klaus watched groups leave, saw the mixture of anticipation and dread on the faces of men returning to a homeland that no longer existed in any form they would recognize. Some were eager to go despite everything, pulled by family ties and the simple desire to be home. Others dragged their feet, had grown accustomed to the certainty and stability of camp life, feared what awaited them in the wasteland Germany had become. Klaus found himself in this second group, found himself volunteering for every work detail and program that might delay his departure, clinging to this strange limbo because at least here he understood the rules, understood his place, understood what was expected of him. But eventually his turn came, his name appeared on a manifest, and he found himself once again boarding a ship, once again making the Atlantic crossing, but in the opposite direction this time and with a completely different mindset. The Klaus who had crossed westward had been frightened and indoctrinated and certain of his beliefs despite their recent shattering. The Klaus crossing eastward was transformed, rebuilt from the foundation up, carrying with him memories and experiences that had no place in the Germany he was returning to. He stood on the deck as America receded behind them, watching the coastline disappear into the haze, and felt something like grief for the loss of this strange chapter of his life. He had been happy here, he realized with shock. A prisoner in an enemy country, cut off from family and home, and he had been happier than he had been in years, because for the first time since childhood he had been allowed to think his own thoughts and question received wisdom and become something other than what the state demanded he be. The ship docked in Bremen in October of 1946, and Klaus got his first look at post-war Germany with his own eyes rather than through censored letters. The devastation was worse than anything he had imagined, worse than the newsreels had conveyed, worse than human language seemed capable of describing. The port city was a landscape of ruins, buildings reduced to hollow shells, streets choked with rubble, people moving through the wreckage like ghosts, their faces showing the blank exhaustion of those who have endured too much for too long. This was home. This was what they had fought for, what thousands had died defending. Klaus stood on the dock with his small bundle of possessions and felt the full weight of the war's consequence settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. All of it for this. All the sacrifice and struggle and propaganda and belief, and this was the result: a country destroyed, its people broken, its future uncertain. The processing center was chaos, refugees and returning soldiers and prisoners all flooding through the same overwhelmed bureaucracy, everyone trying to find family members or secure ration cards or simply figure out where they were supposed to go in a country whose infrastructure had been shattered. Klaus waited in line for hours to receive papers that would allow him to travel to Bavaria, to return to his hometown if it still existed, to find his family if they still lived. Around him, reunions happened with tears and embraces and sometimes the terrible silence of news delivered and received. He heard fragments of stories: husbands learning their wives had died in bombings, children discovering parents who no longer recognized them, families finding that their homes had been occupied or destroyed or seized by occupying authorities. The human cost of defeat was measured in these individual moments of grief and loss, each one a small tragedy multiplied by millions across the ruined nation. The journey to Bavaria took 3 days on trains that barely ran, through landscapes scarred by combat and occupation, past cities that existed only as names on signs amid fields of rubble. Klaus shared a crowded compartment with other former prisoners and refugees, their conversations a mixture of shock at what they were seeing and memories of what had been before. An old woman who had lived in Hamburg before it was firebombed described her neighborhood with a precision that suggested she saw it still behind her eyes, recited street names and shop locations as though by saying them she could make them real again. A young soldier missing an arm talked about his village in East Prussia, now under Soviet control, his family evacuated or dead or trapped behind new borders. Their stories accumulated like stones, the weight of collective trauma that a nation would have to carry forward or be crushed beneath. Klaus found his sister in a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of Munich, living in a converted warehouse with hundreds of others who had nowhere else to go. She had aged a decade in the years since he had seen her, her face thin and lined, her hands rough from labor. Their reunion was tearful and awkward, so much to say and no words adequate to the task of conveying what they had each experienced. She told him about their mother's death during an air raid, about their father's disappearance on the Eastern Front, about her own survival through luck and determination and choices she didn't elaborate on, and Klaus didn't ask about. He told her about his capture, about the camp in Texas, and saw her face shift through expressions of disbelief and incomprehension. "They fed you?" she said. "They showed you movies?" As though these simple facts were more unbelievable than the devastation surrounding them, more difficult to process than the ruin of everything they had known. He stayed with her in the camp for weeks while they figured out what came next, where they could go, how they could rebuild some approximation of life from the wreckage of the old one. In the evenings, he would tell her stories about America, about the camp and the work details and the movie nights, trying to convey to her what that experience had meant, how it had changed him, how it had revealed truths he had never questioned before. She listened with the patience of someone humoring a traumatized relative, not really understanding but willing to let him talk. How could she understand? She had lived through the bombing and the invasion and the occupation, had experienced the war in ways that made his captivity seem like a vacation. His transformation, his awakening to new possibilities, must have seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of her suffering. In the displaced persons camp, Klaus met other former prisoners returning from America, men who had similar stories of unexpected treatment and gradual transformation. They would gather in the evenings and talk about their experiences, comparing camps and work details and the films they had seen, creating a shared narrative that helped them process what had happened to them. It was in these conversations that Klaus began to understand that his experience wasn't unique, that the American prisoner of war program had been operating on a massive scale with a consistent philosophy: treat captured soldiers with basic humanity, feed them adequately, provide structure and even entertainment, and let the contrast between propaganda and reality do the work of changing minds. It had been a form of psychological warfare, Klaus realized, but one conducted through kindness rather than cruelty, one that worked precisely because it contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. Werner Richter appeared one evening, still stubbornly clinging to remnants of the old ideology despite everything. He had returned to find his wife remarried, his home occupied by French soldiers, his former life completely erased. The bitterness had calcified into something hard and unforgiving, and he spoke about betrayal and stab-in-the-back myths and all the old explanations for why they had lost. Klaus listened and recognized his former self in Werner's words, recognized the desperate need to blame someone, to find explanations that didn't require examining one's own complicity or accepting that the cause had been fundamentally wrong. But Klaus couldn't go back to that mindset, couldn't unknow what he had learned, couldn't unsee what he had seen. The movies had been part of it, yes, but so had the kindness of guards and the fairness of treatment, and the simple fact of being treated as human beings rather than expendable resources. These experiences had cracked open his certainty and let new possibilities in, had shown him that the world was more complex and more full of potential than the propaganda had allowed. He and his sister eventually found work in Munich, rebuilding from the rubble, the literal physical labor of reconstruction that paralleled the psychological reconstruction happening inside him. Days were spent hauling stones and mixing concrete and slowly, incrementally, putting pieces back together. It was exhausting work but honest, and Klaus found satisfaction in seeing tangible progress, in being part of something constructive rather than destructive. Around him, Germany was struggling to reinvent itself, to figure out what it meant to be German after Nazism, after defeat, after having the mirror held up to show what they had become. Some embraced this opportunity for transformation, threw themselves into building a new, better Germany. Others retreated into denial or nostalgia or the kind of bitter resentment that Werner embodied. Klaus tried to be in the first group, tried to carry forward what he had learned in Texas, tried to believe that the kindness he had experienced could be a model for something larger. movie theaters began reopening in Munich, showing American films that arrived with the occupation forces. Klaus went to one of these theaters on a Saturday evening in early 1947, bought a ticket with marks that had only recently regained some measure of value, and sat in a darkened cinema watching the same kinds of films he had seen in the camp. The experience was surreal and profound, connected him across time and space to that person he had been in Texas, to those evenings sitting among fellow prisoners watching light flicker on a screen and feeling his certainty crumble. Around him, German civilians watched these films with their own reactions, some hostile to American cultural imperialism, some hungry for any entertainment after years of deprivation, some simply confused by the difference between what they had been taught Americans were, and what these films revealed them to be. After the film, Klaus walked through the reconstructed streets of Munich, past buildings still showing scars of combat, past memorials to the dead, past beer halls where old men gathered to argue about what had gone wrong and who was to blame. He thought about the path that had led him here, from soldier to prisoner to survivor to citizen of a defeated nation trying to rebuild. He thought about the moment in North Africa when he had expected torture and received water instead, about the long transformation that had followed, about the power of small kindnesses to undermine entire ideologies. The Americans, he realized, had understood something profound about human nature, that you don't change minds through force but through demonstration, through showing rather than telling, through treating people as you hope they will become rather than punishing them for what they were. Years passed. Germany split into East and West, became a frontier of the new Cold War, slowly rebuilt from the ashes of total defeat. Klaus married a woman he met through work, had children who grew up knowing nothing of the Reich except through history books and their father's careful explanations. He told them about the war sometimes, about his experiences, about the camp in Texas and the movies they showed and what those movies had meant to him. His children listened with the polite incomprehension of those who have never lived through anything comparable, who couldn't quite grasp what it meant to have your entire worldview dismantled and rebuilt, to discover that everything you believed was wrong. But he told them anyway, felt it was important that someone remember, that the story be passed on even if it couldn't be fully understood. In the 1950s, as Germany experienced its economic miracle and began to look more like a prosperous Western nation than a defeated enemy, Klaus sometimes encountered other former prisoners from the American camps. They would recognize each other somehow, find each other in crowds or at gatherings, drawn together by their shared experience. They would talk about the camps and the work details and especially about the movies, about what those evenings in darkened halls had meant, about how Hollywood films had accomplished what years of Nazi indoctrination couldn't prevent, had shown them a different way of being human, had suggested possibilities beyond the narrow ideological confines they had been raised within. It was their secret history, their transformation narrative, the story of how they had been saved not through punishment but through unexpected kindness. In 1961, Klaus saw a newspaper article about the American prisoner of war program during World War II, a historical retrospective that included statistics he hadn't known. 425,000 German prisoners held in over 700 camps across the United States, treated according to Geneva Convention standards that often exceeded what was required. Fed and clothed and even entertained as part of a deliberate program to demonstrate American values and undermine Nazi ideology. The article mentioned the controversy this had caused at the time, American citizens angry that prisoners were being treated so well while their own sons were dying in combat, camp authorities arguing that humanity and strategy weren't mutually exclusive. Klaus read the article multiple times, trying to see his personal experience within this larger historical context, trying to understand the forces and decisions and philosophies that had shaped his transformation. What the article couldn't capture, was the lived reality of that experience, the way it felt to have your certainties dissolved, to be shown kindness when you expected cruelty, to discover that your enemies were human beings capable of mercy and generosity and grace. Statistics and policy couldn't convey the subjective experience of sitting in a darkened recreation hall watching American cowboys ride across impossible landscapes, and feeling something hard inside you begin to soften, feeling the propaganda losing its grip, feeling new possibilities beginning to emerge. This was the real story, Klaus thought, Not the numbers or the policy debates, but the individual transformations, the thousands of men who had been shaped by that experience, and carried it forward into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. By the 1970s, Klaus was a grandfather, watching his grandchildren grow up in a prosperous, democratic West Germany that would have been unimaginable to his younger self. They were part of a generation that questioned everything, that protested and debated and pushed boundaries. And while Klaus sometimes found their rebelliousness exhausting, he also recognized in it something of what he had experienced in Texas: the questioning of received wisdom, the refusal to accept authority without examination, the insistence that individual conscience mattered more than collective ideology. His grandchildren asked him about the war sometimes, wanted to know what it had been like, what he had believed, how he had changed. He tried to explain about the propaganda and the capture and the camp and especially about the movies. But he could see their incomprehension, their difficulty grasping a world where such total indoctrination was possible and such complete transformation necessary. One evening in 1978, Klaus watched on television a documentary about World War II that included footage of American prisoner of war camps, grainy black and white images of barracks and guard towers and prisoners playing sports and working on farms. The footage was brief, just a few minutes within a larger narrative about the war, but Klaus sat transfixed, transported back across decades to those years in Texas, to that strange liminal time when he had been transformed from soldier to prisoner to something else entirely. The documentary didn't show movie nights, didn't capture that particular aspect of camp life, but Klaus could see it in his memory with perfect clarity: the projector whirring, the screen glowing, the audience of prisoners gradually surrendering to the stories playing out before them, gradually accepting that their enemies were human beings worthy of something other than hatred. After the documentary ended, Klaus sat in the darkness of his living room, the television screen fading to black, lost in memory and reflection. His wife found him there and asked if he was all right, and he nodded, unable to quite explain what he was feeling. It was a complex mixture of gratitude and grief, of recognition that those years in captivity had been in many ways more formative than any other period of his life, that they had saved him not just physically by removing him from combat but psychologically by offering him a path away from the ideology that had poisoned his youth. He had been lucky, he realized, lucky to be captured by Americans rather than Soviets, lucky to be sent to a camp where humanity prevailed over vengeance, lucky to be shown movies and given kindness and treated as though his transformation was possible and worthwhile. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and Klaus watched on television as people danced on its ruins and Germany moved toward reunification. He was an old man by then, his health failing, his memories becoming more vivid even as his connection to the present grew tenuous. He thought often about the arc of his life, about the journey from Nazi soldier to American prisoner to citizen of democratic Germany, about all the moments of choice and chance that had shaped his path. The turning point, he believed, had been those movie nights in Texas, those evenings when the Americans had shown captured enemies that they were capable of creating beauty and humor and hope, that they could extend humanity even to those who had tried to destroy them. This had been the real victory, more profound than any military triumph, the victory of values over ideology, of decency over hatred, of hope over despair. In 1992, as Germany continued its process of reunification and reckoning with its divided past, Klaus received a letter from an American university professor researching the prisoner of war program during World War II. The professor was collecting oral histories from former prisoners, wanted to interview them about their experiences, wanted to preserve their stories before it was too late. Klaus agreed to participate, found himself talking for hours into a tape recorder about memories he had carried for almost 50 years, about North Africa and the Atlantic crossing in Camp Hearne in Texas, and especially about the movies, always about the movies. The professor listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, seemed to understand that what Klaus was describing wasn't just a historical curiosity, but a lesson about human nature and the power of compassion to transform even deeply indoctrinated minds. "What did the movies mean to you?" the professor asked, and Klaus struggled to find words adequate to the answer. "Everything," he said finally. "They meant everything. They showed us we were wrong. Not through preaching or propaganda or re-education camps, but just by existing, by being beautiful and human and full of hope. They showed us what America actually was, not what we had been told it was. They showed us possibilities we had never imagined, ways of thinking and being that the Third Reich had tried to erase from our consciousness. Every time we watched a film, we were being given a choice, to cling to our old beliefs or to accept new truths. And slowly, film by film, night by night, we chose truth. We chose humanity. We chose to believe that the world could be something other than what we had been taught. The interview left Klaus exhausted but somehow lighter, as though unburdening himself of the story had freed something inside him that had been held captive for decades. He knew he didn't have much time left, could feel his body failing in the incremental ways that old bodies fail, but he felt satisfied that he had contributed his piece to the historical record, that future generations might learn from his experience. The lesson, he hoped, was clear, that transformation is always possible, that no indoctrination is complete enough to fully erase human capacity for change, that small acts of kindness and humanity can undermine even the most powerful propaganda. These were lessons the world seemed to need to relearn in every generation, lessons that remained relevant long after the specific circumstances that taught them had passed into history. Klaus died in the spring of 1994, surrounded by family, his final years spent in peace and relative prosperity in a reunified Germany that bore little resemblance to the country he had left to fight for more than 50 years earlier. At his funeral, his oldest grandson spoke about his grandfather's transformation, about the importance of remaining open to change and willing to question one's beliefs, about the power of compassion to break through even the most rigid ideological barriers. The grandson mentioned the movies, the Hollywood films shown to German prisoners in Texas camps, and the profound effect they had had on Klaus's worldview, and ultimately on his life. It was, the grandson said, a reminder that culture and kindness could be weapons more powerful than bombs, that the best victory is the one that transforms enemies into friends rather than simply destroying them. In the decades that followed, as the last generation who had lived through World War II gradually passed away and the war receded into the realm of history rather than living memory, Klaus's story became part of a larger narrative about the American prisoner of war program and its long-term effects. Historians and sociologists studied the program as an example of how to conduct psychological operations through positive means rather than torture or deprivation, how to plant seeds of democratic values in fertile soil prepared by the contrast between propaganda and reality. The movie nights became a particular focus of study, recognized as a brilliant stroke of cultural diplomacy that had accomplished more than any interrogation could have, had shown prisoners that Americans were capable of creating art and beauty, that they valued entertainment and storytelling, that they saw prisoners as human beings worthy of having their spirits lifted rather than broken. The camps themselves had long since been dismantled, the barracks torn down, and the land returned to other uses, but their legacy persisted in the 425,000 men who had passed through them and returned to Germany carrying new perspectives and new possibilities. Many of these men, like Klaus, became part of the generation that rebuilt West Germany as a democratic, prosperous nation integrated into Western institutions and values. They brought with them memories of fair treatment and human dignity, of a system that had shown them alternatives to authoritarianism and militarism, of those evenings watching American films and gradually understanding that the world could be organized according to principles other than domination and struggle. This was their contribution to the post-war reconstruction, this lived experience of a different way of being, this knowledge that societies could be built on compassion and rule of law rather than force and fear. The movie nights in particular remained powerful in collective memory, became almost mythic in their significance, symbols of a larger transformation that had occurred across the entire prisoner population. Former prisoners would tell their children and grandchildren about sitting in darkened halls watching Hollywood films, about the cognitive dissonance of being entertained by their captors, about the slow dawning realization that everything they had believed about Americans was wrong. These stories became part of family lore, passed down across generations, morphing slightly with each retelling but maintaining their essential truth, that compassion had been more effective than cruelty, that understanding had been more powerful than hatred, that the best way to defeat an ideology was to demonstrate its opposite through action rather than simply arguing against it with words. In the 21st century, as new conflicts raised old questions about how to treat enemy prisoners, about whether torture was ever justified, about the effectiveness of harsh interrogation techniques versus relationship building and respect, the World War II American prisoner of war program was frequently invoked as a case study. Researchers pointed to the low rate of serious incidents in the camps, the relatively positive attitudes former prisoners expressed toward their captors, the successful reintegration of prisoners into post-war society as productive democratic citizens. They pointed to the movie nights as a specific example of how cultural exposure could break down prejudices and open minds, how entertainment could be a tool of transformation when deployed thoughtfully and paired with genuine humanitarian treatment. The lessons seemed clear, though whether they were learned and applied was a different question, one that each generation had to answer for itself. Somewhere in an archive in Texas, there existed a record of Camp Hearne's movie nights, what films were shown, on what dates, to what audiences. The list included westerns and musicals and comedies and dramas, the full range of Hollywood's wartime output, entertainment made without specific thought to how it would be received by captured German soldiers but perfectly suited to the task of demonstrating American values and American culture. Each title on that list represented an evening when hundreds of men sat in darkness and watched stories unfold, stories about heroism and redemption and second chances, about communities coming together and individuals standing up for what's right and the possibility of building better futures from flawed pasts. Each film was a small seed planted in prepared soil, and from those seeds had grown new understandings, new possibilities, new lives built on different foundations than the ones that had crumbled in the war. The projector that had shown those films was long gone, scrapped or repurposed or lost to time, but its light continued to shine in memory and in the lives it had touched. Klaus Becker was one of thousands who had sat in its beam and been transformed, who had expected torture and received instead something far more powerful and far more lasting, the gift of new sight, the ability to see beyond propaganda and hatred to the common humanity that connects even enemies. The understanding that the highest victory is not in destroying one's opponents but in winning them over through demonstration of superior values. This was the real story of the American prisoner of war program during World War II, not the statistics or the policy decisions but the individual transformations, the men who arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich and left as potential citizens of a democratic future, changed not through force but through the revolutionary act of being treated with basic human dignity. And so the story comes full circle, from that moment in the North African desert when Klaus Becker lay face down in the sand expecting the worst, to his peaceful death in a reunified Germany decades later, the arc of transformation complete. In between lay the Atlantic crossing and the Texas camp and the work details and especially those movie nights, those moments out of time when entertainment became education and culture became weapon and kindness became revolution. They expected torture, those German soldiers captured across Europe and North Africa and loaded onto ships bound for America. They expected brutality and deprivation and all the horrors they had been promised would befall them in enemy hands. Instead, America gave them movies, and in doing so gave them something far more valuable, a glimpse of a different way of being human, a different way of organizing society, a different set of values to build lives upon. Not every prisoner was transformed. Not every man who sat in those darkened halls watching American films came away changed. But enough did, enough were reached and changed and carried those changes back to Germany, that the program must be counted as one of the great successes of the war, a victory achieved not through violence but through the patient demonstration that the enemy's values were worth adopting, that there was a better way forward than the one they had been following. That even in the midst of total war it was possible to see the humanity in those you fought against, and to treat them accordingly. This was the lesson of the movie nights, the legacy of Camp Hearne and the 700 other facilities like it scattered across America, the quiet triumph of compassion over hatred, of hope over despair, of the revolutionary idea that even enemies deserve to be treated as human beings. They expected torture, but America gave them movies, and in that simple unexpected gesture of humanity lay a transformation more profound than any force of arms could have achieved, A victory that resonated across decades and continues to echo whenever we ask ourselves how to treat those we've captured, how to build peace from the rubble of war, how to see the humanity in those we've been taught to hate. The answer, Klaus Becker learned in a recreation hall in Texas watching Hollywood cowboys ride across impossible landscapes, is simpler and more difficult than we imagine. We extend kindness, we offer dignity, we show rather than tell, and we trust that given the choice between propaganda and lived reality, between hatred and humanity, people will choose the truth that's been demonstrated to them through action. This is what America did for Klaus and 425,000 men like him, and this is why, decades later, as an old man preparing to die, he could look back on his captivity not with bitterness but with gratitude, recognizing that those years behind barbed wire watching American films had been the years when he learned to be free.